honor of moderating, chairing this this event. Welcome to all of you, important people and all important people, of course, in the room and online. We hope that we'll have a great discussion for the next little while. So for people in the room, this is also being it's also being live streamed, and for people who are watching online, live streamed on the MISTRA YouTube channel, where it will also reside after the event on our channel MISTRA South Africa. Those who are in the room, of course, after the presentation by Susan, and I'll introduce her in a while, you will be able to ask questions here. Those who are online, please put your questions in the Q&A. You can do whatever you like in the chat, but your questions for the panel should be in the Q&A, and we will then get those questions from there. Also, for people who might be very busy on social media, you're welcome to tweet, X it, because that's how we should be saying it. Exit, Facebook it, etc. If you do, please use these hashtags: Coalitions SA, or Coalitions Barometer, or MISTRA Coalitions Barometer. All three, if you like, although you don't have many characters left after that. So let me get straight into it then, without much more of an introduction. I think that the topic will be very well dealt with by Professor Susan Boyson, so I'm not going to give an introduction to the topic. But we'll start with opening remarks from Dr. Yaqub Aba Umar. Aba, as we all fondly know him, is the Director of Operations at MISTRA.
Okay, thank you, Naeem. Dear colleagues, friends, and comrades, I know in FES we're allowed to call comrades here as well. We're really glad we've reached this milestone in our project around the Coalition Barometer. I want to start off by saying that given our debt to the FES, I made sure it came in blue, but my colors are still red, green, and gold. Or black, green, and gold. It's a combination of red and black there. Firstly, thank you to the FES for having supported this project from its very inception. You know, we've had a bit of a history, a long history with the Frederick Edward Stiftung, and they've been supporting us through and through our tough times and our good times. As colleagues know, the MISTRA stands for the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. So we try and choose topics that look way into the future. And this one around coalition was one that we had chosen quite well, because by the time we got to the local government election of 2021, coalition was a big issue. We released this very thick volume that you have on display there, that was edited by Susan Boyce. It was a huge success, and a lot of people have now used that as the reference point for just about any discussion of coalition South Africa, and especially the title, Marriages of Inconvenience. So I think it captured the kind of ethos that was going into the consideration of what kind of alliances should be built when coalitions are coming up. Now, as I said, MISTRA stands for Strategic Reflection, Mapungubwe Institute. And people often ask, what does the A stand for? It actually stands for action. And so as a result of this book that we came out with, we've been engaging in a lot of other actions. And one of that has been the development of the Coalition Barometer, which FES sponsored, and which we then had an executive summary, high-level summary released last year, October. That was a very successful event. What we're doing today is now ensuring that the very, very full volume of 400 somewhat pages report report is now available, and it's got the details that we would have of all the hung councils in South Africa. It has been a labor of love, especially on the part of Susan, to get this out. A lot of hard work, a lot of long hours, and a lot of screaming at mayor's offices and so forth. But we've arrived at this point in time. But the action is going to continue because at MISTRA, we have decided that we will come out with a regular update on the barometer. We say regular because initially we wanted it to be annual, and now we're not sure if we're going to be able to get it annually, but I think saying regular just keeps it vague enough for us to come out with it every now and again. But we hope to come out pretty soon with the next iteration of that. And we're glad that we've had some sponsors that have come on board to support our work on the coalition. That is particularly the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the Millennium Trust. So the work will go forward, the work will continue, and we hope to keep engaging with that. So having said all that and put a plug in for MISTRA's work, and I'll hand you over to Naeem, who will formally introduce the guest, the speaker of the day.
Thank you, Abba. And the book, the big book that Abba referred to, not the one, the picture there, that's the Barometer, which deals with the period 2021 to 23. But before that, we had this book, also a big book, Marriages of Inconvenience, the Politics of Coalitions in South Africa, edited by Susan. So let me introduce Susan before calling her up to do her presentation. Professor Susan Boyson is the Director of Research at MISTRA. She's a political scientist, author, and analyst, and many of us have heard and seen her on radio, TV, and read her articles, etc. She focuses on African politics, policy, governance, elections, political sociology, and research methodology. She's also emeritus professor at Wits University and visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. She held a full professorship at Nelson Mandela University from 1998 to 2005. Susan is the author and editor of several seminal titles on South African politics. I like the word seminal, but nevertheless, very sexist. But nevertheless, she's the editor of several extremely important titles on South African politics. The most recent being When Wedding Bells Ring. You can see the kind of themes that Susan focuses on. Marriages, weddings. When Wedding Bells Ring, Coalitions with or Without Concord. And this one here, Marriages of Inconvenience, the Politics of Coalitions in South Africa, among many others. She has published other books on the African National Congress, multi-party democracy, local elections, decolonization, and governance. You're not allowed to ask her who's going to win the elections. Susan.
Nobody.
That's the whole point of today.
Thank you very much.
I think this would.
Sure. And thank you very much, colleagues. Good morning. Thank you, everybody online. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to FES for hosting this event and for all the introductions. The question I get asked most frequently, and I cannot get tired of it, so feel free to ask it again, especially in the course of this conversation, it's mostly called the mess at local government coalition level, going to be transferred into the national scene. And there isn't a simple answer. But what I do know is that MISTRA's Coalitions Barometer offers quite a few suggestions as to what the kind of political conduct is in relation to coalitions that have been adopted, that have possibly become ingrained in South African politics, has become the new rules as to how we South Africans, we the political parties, conduct elections and conduct coalition-related elections afterwards. And that is basically the name of election 2024. I think nothing defines it as vividly as the kind of connotation to coalitions. It's fought in that context, all parties
fight for a campaign for an outright majority. Nobody wants to concede upfront that they're not really running, cannot possibly get a majority. Maybe some can, maybe some cannot, we don't know. And it's in their relations with other parties that they are very often defined. So this is our conversation for today. Normally trying to extract what we have, like, what we could learn from the coalition's barometer and from MISTRA's monitoring of the coalitions of 70 case studies at local government level, local and metropolitan municipalities, what we can learn from that that could help chart a way forward because it is an unregulated territory. I'll say more about that later, but politicians and political parties of South Africa do not want to be regulated. I think I can say that with good reason. I'll get to that motivation later. On the slide, just very quickly, um, it is just going to be a quick half an hour or so talk here. A quick few points. I think we've already dealt largely with MISTRA's Coalitions Barometer 1, ongoing work, etc. After that, I'll start extracting the lessons about coalition partners, about coalition operations, about coalition government, transferability of local lessons to national and provincial. What is being taken forward? What is political parties, what are they choosing to adopt and how to conduct those coalitions and not to conduct it? Then look a little more into South Africa's unregulated coalition spheres, reluctance to impose rules, the unfolding political terrain, more party political at that point, requiring coalitions, and then coalition options barometer and study of South African politics 2024. I think from this outline is already pretty evident that I cannot blame MISTRA for everything that I will be saying this morning. And that's my methodology presentation. Obviously is anchored in the coalitions barometer, but also depends on my personal analysis and interpretation of South African politics. And that is why we have a discussion time, ample discussion time at the end, as long as I rush through this discussion sufficiently enough so that we can hear your, in the room and online, your views on this unfolding political terrain and how it interfaces with coalition. So the first one, then this is, on my next slide, I'm more structured than this one. This is roughly the unfolding experience, and it looks like helter-skelter, chaos, pandemonium in coalition land in South Africa, which it basically was. And this is really the story of the coalition barometer content in an unstructured form here. It's embedded in numbers. The numbers game is crucial. Several slides refer to that. The results, the shortfalls. If some political party fits the bill, as to I, the biggest party, I've got a shortfall of about 2 or 3 percentage points to get to my outright majority, then the eyes turn to which parties can offer that. And parties often do not come with big policy demands. And as long as they get nice positions and nice recognition, they will fall. And ideology really doesn't matter that much at that level. Small parties are elevated. We all know the stories about elevation of small parties, disproportional coalition rights. And that is a culture that has become so embedded in South African coalition politics. Small parties saying, if we can give you your majority, we want to be free. Mostly minimal coalitions that are built, small as possible, or I'll return to this, confidence and supply arrangements. Confidence and supply arrangements really referring to essential, not formal coalitions, permanent coalitions, but some political parties come together to help give a party a majority at, for example, votes of confidence and supply in budget votes that often have to be passed by majority. And that can be quite possible, quite important going forward as well. publicly accountable negotiations is absolutely shunned. Parties do not want to, almost absolutely shunned. Parties do not want to be seen to be negotiating formally, and it is often the point that these negotiations should really be moderated, professionally facilitated. That we haven't seen much so far. Power and position are the main driving forces, allocation of positions. They occasionally think scarce negotiation about service to specific communities. That is not a strong point in a little bit of coalition negotiations at the local level that we have seen. Parties shy away from, they don't shy away from breaking approach. If they've got a coalition agreement today, if it's not good for tomorrow, then let's move on. Let's find another coalition agreement. One needs strong stomach to handle coalition politics. Parties do not shy away from breaking and realigning. Coalition crossing is quite frequent. There's always another reason for a motion of no confidence in the local council. Provincial interventions are limited. Provinces should be intervening. They have got that legal obligation to do that. They often don't do that or do that in a party aligned way. There's a frequent resort to litigation at local level on issues like did the speaker have the right to call or to refuse this motion of no confidence or this debate, that type of thing. So this is the picture overall of local government coalitions in South Africa. And that is why one gets that frequent questions. Are we going to see this? It's not getting more systematic here. And the first set of lessons come with a selection of coalition partners, when parties arrive at the coalitions. The numbers game, I've referred to that just now. The extent of the shortfall. We see now pre-election parties really all claim to be running for an outright majority. They call about what their coalition visions are. They do not want to commit before election. They really want, everybody's playing the game of wait and see. See how much the shortfall is, see who fits the bill, and then doesn't matter about policy, ideology, those can probably be negotiated within certain limits. There are certain limits. I'll refer to that in a minute. Party image and fallout is considered. What damage will it do to this party if they align with that party, especially then when it comes to a next election? Will their voters disapprove by not voting for them again? That happens internationally very often. Negotiations are hidden, agreements minimal. So those are the basic patterns that we see emerging from the local government. The relations between coalition partners, the durability of coalitions. We also get several lessons from the Barometer of that. Innovation of small parties, coalition agreements. No, don't go there. It may constrain us. Indispensable coalition crossing par for the course. Public service positions serve as bargaining chips. It should not, we know the huge debate that South Africa is conducting in a bit of esoteric, abstract terms about professionalization of the public service. Those positions are still bargaining chips in coalition formations. Higher order national provincial party realignment often disrupts coalitions and coalition government. Some of the most unstable coalitions, like KwaZulu-Natal in 2021 to 2023 was probably the most unstable coalition province. But that is where it was realignment, EFF moving away from the DA, aligning with the ANC, National Freedom Party realigning, etc. And those higher level realignments cause a lot of instability, these umbrella agreements. Then the third set of lessons here, operation of coalition governments and some of the lessons we've learned. Opposition parties pursue the fall of incumbents. He isn't something like a good opposition. Parties deciding we go to the opposition benches. We haven't won the election. Let's go and be a constructive opposition. Many of them claim to do that, but that is where a huge amount of instability comes from. And thank you very much. There's a very big political party in South Africa that's very good at being bad at the opposition benches. And then in the election campaigns, cry out, coalitions are unstable, they're bad. You have to make sure you vote for a certain party in order to avoid that there will be coalitions because they're bad. But they, of course, much of their badness in there. There's a tyranny of motions of no confidence. That's something for which there's really an outcry to be a lot of control. Collusion with provincial governments, resort to litigation, service and serving secondary, and local government. So fine, there are so many of these local governments, 257, and they find refuge in obscurity there. That's one thing when national government is really much more visible. Eyes are going to be focused if there is a coalition at national government or provincial government level. Eyes, public attention is going to be focused on those coalition governments much more than what has been possible at the local level. So I think they will be much more enforced accountability. So what drives the choice of coalition? And this is really my interpretation of the coalition's barometer research here. 6 factors that I identify here. The size of the vote, the shortfall. Absolutely. Then maybe to some extent, ideological thrust and the party image. There are limits to that. Parties can always re-explain their previous answers, etc. So those can be overridden, and we have seen at local government level. Think, for example, ANC Patriotic Alliance. Patriotic Alliance and ANC cooperate very well in stable coalition governments, several local government coalitions, as we see in a barometer. However, should they perhaps have to come together at a national level to constitute a majority, think of other policy issues such as Palestine, Gaza, or xenophobia, etc., how that would be handled with that one. So there are a few complicating factors there. Political identity, race of parties, obviously, that's why the ANC and the DA, legislative parties, cannot just get together, because that would also on the left side. How would those voters of the ANC, for example, react if EA people do not like that, and then the ANC suffers in future because they may be seen to have aligned with a party that is right-wing or reactionary on policies X, Y, Z. And ANC voters could then perhaps in future punish ANC. This is a phenomenon that happens in coalition politics. And that's why often we see shortly before elections, smaller parties in coalitions often exit those coalitions so that can create more of an autonomous image in the voter mind in the run up to the election. And that's why in a period before elections, coalition governments are generally very unstable. Let me just return to the bottom of the circle. Personal relations across party boundaries. That can play a huge role. Irrespective of policy controversies, etc. Boundaries between the EFF and ANC often their papers in. Their personal friendship, youth league links, etc. Socialization over weekends. And by different political parties in parliament and provinces, etc. That can play a role in future coalition negotiations. And then learned coalition behavior, top left, is a 6th factor that I think is very important. Think, for example, the ANC currently, I can't say this is an official ANC position, but there are many in the ANC that feel that EFF is too erratic in its policy demands, that it cannot be trusted. We take a consistent line and not to change midstream. We want more of this or less of that, or other political parties. And the DA has taken this specific stance after local government experience that they do not
want to align with the EFF because they've been burnt in local government coalitions. So there's all these factors that come into this mix that we see when it comes to the choice of parties. I'm not going to go through this one in detail. This is straight from the coalition's barometer, which is free for download on the MISTRA website, by the way. And just look at these ones, the big lines, uppercase black letters. And that is important because it gives the four main types of coalitions that have been emerging from practice at local government level. The first one, and this I find very interesting and one that is underexplored in our narratives of coalitions that emerging from the barometer, and probably map the terrain running up to the elections right now. And that one is a type of consensual coalition, de facto coalition, where the ANC, and this especially at local government level in a few cases, the ANC is by far the biggest party. Other opposition parties do know that they haven't got any chance to pull together a matching coalition that will outstrip
the ANC support in those cases. They let, in those cases, it's mostly the ANC, the opposition parties then let the ANC get on with governance, and the ANC then counts on other parties to come in on this confidence and supply basis. When there is a budget that has to be passed, there will be negotiations. And yes, that budget gets its 50% to be passed. Or when somebody is elected, mayor, etc., speaker, parties come together, and there's always bargaining, there's always a give and take. So it's a very conditional type of a relationship too, but there isn't a formal coalition that comes together. And I sometimes wonder whether that would not be a likelihood for the national level if the ANC does come short of the 50% majority, whether it wouldn't choose to run basically as a minority government, but with occasional, where the majority is required, those occasional reliance and agreements on some opposition party. It would mean that there will have to be continuous negotiations, and different parties will come in and out of the central power picture, probably. Maybe a more consistent, endurable alliance could be emerging out of that, but that is a possibility. The second one that's very prevalent at local government level in these 70 coalition case studies that we do in the barometer is their minimal top-up is required. This one is well explored in much of the narratives around coalitions emerging, possible emerging coalitions. There's a range of existing small parties, a range of new political parties. We do not yet know where they are going to stand. But remember, for each percentage of support that the ANC is short in Parliament, for example, the 4 MPs is required. And so many of these small parties would perhaps have to come together. We know in the past there's quite a history of micro parties that come in with get representation in Parliament on below 1% of the vote. 0.25% is what is required to get 1 MP. And the complex one we've seen at local government level is a very difficult one to manage. We've seen that in metros, Gauteng metros, in eThekwini, in Nelson Mandela Bay, very difficult. You can see more others in the coalition barometer. So let me quickly move to more on transferability. There is definitely scope for transfer of lessons. Like we've seen at local government level, sufficient time is needed for negotiation. We know coalition negotiations are happening in some ways at the moment, even in this run up to the election. That is not definitive. Everybody's waiting, it has the wait and see game. So, but after the election, it will basically be a two-week period that is available from the time that the results are known. Results will probably be, so far, the plan is that it will be announced on Sunday, the 2nd of June. 2 weeks later takes us to June the 16th on a Sunday, and then Monday will be a public holiday. So one probably looks at Parliament's first sitting where a president has to be elected, so say, and probably around Tuesday the 18th. So that is the time that will be available for those coalition negotiations. One cannot imagine that a party like the ANC would go into those secret ballot elections without having a solid agreement. So one cannot say a president will be elected, but there needn't be a coalition at that stage, because there will have to be, it's going to be felt the effect of having one or not having one at that stage. Good. Some of the transferability of these lessons also in the need, really. There should be, and here we can only implore the political parties to improve on the practice that we've seen at local government level, to enter formal agreements, to let those agreements pivot on policy programs, irrespective of ideologies and broad stances and narratives. I think political parties in South Africa generally easily agree on shared policy programs that tie them together. Take a minimum time for coalition validity. Ensure that it's not something that can be scrapped tomorrow and another coalition can be put in place, or another set of coalition partners can take shape. That will be bad for the country. Set a threshold for representation in the executive. Do not let this pattern of one person parties become a mayor, etc. That does not hold much water. Encourage forged party maturity instead of formal oversight bodies. There is no, in this unregulated field, there is no regulatory authority over coalitions in government. And there is not going to be one. So all one can ask for is political parties to act with maturity, and for party leaders to encourage parties to do that. Other lessons too on the legislature or council side, the bureaucracy, afford sufficient time for constitution of government. Maybe in future that will be expanded. For now, there is not a specific rule that says that bring a new government, new cabinet maybe, in a certain period of time. There's an expectation that it will happen very soon after a president is elected, but it's not, the time is not specifically defined. Some of the lessons that also need to take forward is biggest party does not get outright majority rights. Of course, this is an issue that comes into play when we look at minority. But what are the limits to the powers that a minority government can then assume? That is something that really requires reflection. Limit notions of no confidence. Use secret ballot only selectively. Law disruptions and legislative council antics that we've seen so amply at local government level. And build firewalls between legislature and bureaucracy. Of course, this assumes that all bureaucrats are doing their work and are doing it well. And some of them really deserve to be replaced, I would say. So, but do not use those as bargaining chips.
South Africa's unregulated coalition spheres. And why I say, this is more my interpretations, why there is a seeming reluctance to have new rules or too many rules that can constrain these coalitions. And this slide comes from the work that Professor Jaap de Visser and I did for the Office of the Deputy Presidency late last year, beginning this year, taking forward the work that our National Coalitions Dialogue that was held in August last year in Cape Town. And these are just give you an idea of some of the proposals that were made, mostly in this column here, to help give direction, future frameworks. And this is very much in line with what I've just said. You can all work through this in due course. There is much scope for improvement, for regulation, but we know that this is not formalized. And that is also part of the reason why we go into an uncharted, unregulated terrain here, coming this election and the likely coalitions that will follow in the wake of it. If we have more time later, I can come back to this. But the point is, there are sets of proposals for regulation that are somewhere in the system, but they are not being processed. At local government level, there is new pending legislation that is out for discussion. And in that, some of these proposals do resonate, but only some of them. In summary, the lessons from the Barometer then. Institutionalize pre-election alliance announcements. Make it public, make it bring that accountability in there to make sure it's not something that can just be scrapped for convenience sake. If a legislative body then arises, follows through the sufficient period of negotiation, anchored in policies and programs. Formalize the agreement, make it public, parties committed to the deliverables rules. Exit clauses be known and marked for the coalition partners. There has to be some agreed mechanism for oversight and enforcement. This mechanism, very importantly, can also be maturity of political parties. It need not be an external body. It can be political parties coming to the table and work, being determined, committed to work together for the better of the people. Overall, curtailment of legislature tricks and antics, limit bias and interference by other spheres of government, not so relevant at national level. Optimize and ensure the flow of governance, something that really often stalled at local government level. So what is unfolding South Africa's political terrain, requiring coalitions and management? You all know this so well. So I just summarize this in one slide here. Of course, we all know this is a big moment. This definition of this election is so defined by the fact that the ANC has been on a jagged curve of decline, but nevertheless, coming in this election to the first point, obviously, of probably moving below 50%, unless the election campaigns of the last few weeks have really reversed fortunes. And so far, polls and tracking polls say that it has been an improvement, but not a reversal to above 50%. It's very important in this is that the ANC remains the predominant party. Not dominant in the old sense of the word, maybe not a majority party, but it's not collapsing, it's not disappearing. It will still be the predominant party by far, at least, and probably at least twice as big as the biggest second political party, which is still a huge presence in politics. And it will also probably mean that it retains much control over government institutions. And that is something to figure into the configuration of the coalitions. It's difficult to envisage, though possible that the ANC is not part of a governing coalition. So it probably will be there. And much of this predominance, despite slipping probably below 50%, is that the ANC is weaker, but there's no opposition that singularly rises into that space. And this is because there's been much fractioning of the DA, also of the ANC, fragmentation of party politics rather than one singular opposing political force. That means South Africa doesn't go into this category of alternation, clear alternation of governing parties once the big party declines. There isn't a clear successor. There isn't a clear alliance of opposition parties that can slip into that space. The multi-party charter does come close to fulfilling that definition, even if in terms of percentages, it falls quite a bit short on that. And the fractioning of the ANC, we all have seen that over several elections ago, the EFF, now the MK party. And of course, there's a big riddle. Maybe the audience can help me solve this riddle of the dual character MK party and the role it plays, even conspiracies. Conspiracy is something you cannot prove right or wrong. So yeah, there we go. That it could be an ANC project to help the ANC scoop up that support that becomes available and ensure that in due course it can feed back into the ANC. Personally, I do not believe that conspiracy holds water, but yes, it is the theorization, speculation about that is out there because it's, yeah, there are uncanny trends in there. It's the strangest of political parties in due course. I guess there will be books written on that political party and whether it was ever a political party or some chimera of sorts. This is just a little slide from Ipsos. I'm not going to go into detail, but just to remind us of the proportions of parties, and the Ipsos one is usually quite reliable when it comes to election times. Usually, and not perfectly on target, but a few percentage points off here and there. And this last one was in April, so it's 4 months old. And we know the ANC has increased slightly. But this is a broad picture that is important to bear in mind as to respect of party political trends. So, towards scenarios, MISTRA is an expert at scenarios, and my little scenarios, I don't call them scenarios here, I call them towards scenarios, because it really just captures one or two other points, and there are just two of these slides left. This one, first one is not my central one here. It is a broad, and this is so contentious, everybody will classify the political parties differently, whether they're left, center, or right, because ideological convergence is supposed to be one of the indicators as to whether political parties will be aligning, pooling their sources, etc. We know that in coalition formations, these ideological considerations are not going to be absolute. They are going to be cross the left and the right. And if one can differentiate the left from the right, and many people say that a spectrum is really, ideological spectrum is in a circle, that the left meets the right at some point. But in terms of statements and practices, several of these parties, and even some that are in the center, can also on occasion be on the far right, etc. So political alignment, ideological alignment in South African politics, I think is quite diffuse. And we know the biggest ideology of South Africa probably has is talk radical, walk reactionary, that type of thing. And so, yeah, it's very negotiable. We know ideological difference has not constrained parties from forming coalitions in the past. So more likely is probably to be valid is the vote shortfall and what we can expect on that front. And here for now, I call them from S1 to S7 for, let's say, roughly a scenario, even if it's very skeletal scenario. S1 and S2 on the left and the right, either the ANC gains an outright majority or an opposition grouping gains an outright majority. These are two possibilities. I would say that the ANC gains an outright majority is still unlikely at this stage, although I don't think there would be a huge shortfall. If the ANC does gain an outright majority, it will probably be quite fragile majority. Very, very aware that it was only just achieved to be at a certain level of support. Even more unlikely is that a specific opposition grouping will gain an outright majority. Unlikely at this stage. The multi-party charter has not made enough progress. The polls hardly move about 30%. And we know that they're driving hard at the campaign at this stage of every vote counts, making voters aware that their individual vote can make that difference. So they're working for a big turnout. And yeah, we do not know whether it will be much beyond 30%. I do not see a left alliance come up anyway, because however we calculate parties that may be considered to be left, they do not go beyond 20% really. So the bulk of the possibilities in terms of scenarios are in this sort of overexplored terrain by now. And that is the middle ground of the ANC coming in at a smallish shortfall, and then just requiring top-up support. Let's say if the ANC is at 47 to 50% range, then a few small parties can probably make it. But remember, 4 MPs for each percentage point. So, and quite a few of these parties will come in at below 1% of the national vote. Now, quite a few MPs will still be collected there, unless it goes into the second category, easy coalition. They have often worked together in the past, the ANC and the IFB. Even if the IFB is part of the multi-party charter, we know these coalition agreements, they can come and go any day, and so can the multi-party charter. But that would be an easy alliance for the ANC and maybe IFB plus a few of the smaller parties. We do not know at this stage exactly which ones. Patriotic Alliance is one that is growing. Al Jamal is there. Several other parties, these smaller parties, African Independent Congress, traditionally supported the ANC. Hood is probably fading. National Freedom Party is probably fading. So difficult to line up a set of small parties there. If a major partner is needed, and major I call in that range, the ANC goes between 38 and 44%, a party of the size of the EFF would be able to fill that gap. We know the EFF has been used as markets go scared, investors are reported to run away, etc. But I don't think there is all that credence in the type of threat that is posed there. So that is a possibility that can be pursued. And as I said just now, those boundaries between parties are often very thin. And there are lots of natural alliances. That always remains a possibility. Even if policy demand, erratic behavior, etc., can be quite a turnoff. Government of national unity could be a face-saving option. My scenario 6 there, where an alliance with the DA can be formed if the ANC really comes short of votes, and it can be a general umbrella agreement given as national interest, but there will be a necessity of recognition of a national crisis. I think few people can argue that there is not a national governance crisis and economic policy crisis in South Africa at this stage. So that remains an option. And scenario 7, minority government, what I've referred to on a few occasions this morning, in terms of confidence in supply agreements, and then aligning with parties variably across several issues, budgets, policy votes, etc. That remains a big possibility. Good. And then that is the end of my input here. I'm not sure whether you are any wiser here. Thank you very much. I use a lot of possibility.
Yes, but how can we not be wiser?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. Not sure about wiser, but certainly we have much more knowledge than we did when we started. Just a reminder that this is being live streamed on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later as well. And those who want to ask questions online, please put your questions in the Q&A. On the Zoom, in your chat, you should also find a link for the high-level summary of the coalition's barometer, and we'll also put a link there for the full barometer, the full document, 400 odd pages. If you get in there and you're a little confused, just click on where it says table of contents, and it will come up and you will get the whole thing. All participants here and online will receive a thank you email after the seminar to thank you for attending and participating. And in there we'll have the links as well, in case you miss it on the chat or you forget. So let's begin with that. Comments. Any questions from the room? We have a couple of questions online, but let's see if there's any from the room. Bruce, thank you. It's just identify ourselves. Yes, please. For the sake of people online here,
Brooks Spector, Daily Maverick, and various other activities. If you don't read it, you should. Have to put the plug in there, right? Two questions for Susan, actually. One is you highlighted the question, the phenomena of litigation between parties in the process of either forming coalitions or breaking apart in coalitions. Why is there so much litigation as opposed to political negotiation? What drives that phenomenon? Why the recourse to a court? And my second question is more of a comment, but I think you can infer a question in it. In some countries, the negotiation process between different factions becomes an internal party negotiation, and as a result, there is a discussion about policies and the division of the spoils and everything else that goes with that within a party and its various factions, rather than between various parties. So in effect, if you have a two-party political system, you actually have a whole lot of different parties, but they group together in two traditional or sometimes three parties. And I'm going to propose a possibility for you. Proportional representation tends to drive smaller party creation, and constituency-based politics tend to drive intra-party negotiation. And I'll let you debate that or disagree or agree with me.
Thank you, Brooks. Next question.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation, Susan. I'm Dr. Mercedes Sele from the Development Bank of Southern Africa. So we focus more on infrastructure development, particularly on municipal levels. So I know in one of the lessons learned you mentioned, you said there has to be limited motions of no confidence within a coalition government. So how has the number of motions of no confidence affected service delivery, particularly in the municipal space? And do you see that as something that will manifest itself on a national level, whereby the number of no confidence also affects service delivery on a larger scale? Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, I'm going to pass this one to you. We have a few questions online. We'll take that in the next round. Any questions that Susan doesn't want to answer, we'll ask MISTRA's executive director. You're not allowed to ask him if the ANC will win the elections because we know his answer to that.
Thank you. Shall I pass the mic now? Thank you, guys, for these questions. Fascinating ones. Yes, Brooks Victor on litigation and how so much litigation. At the municipal level, we've really seen parties digging in and also often inspired by and driven by their political principles, who really want to take control of a certain council. And they are really pushed also beyond the particular local council, not to negotiate and rather to try to rely on external sources. Sometimes there have been various judgments from these cases of litigation. They very often go into longer term are judged not to be urgent motions, and then they go on to the longer court proceedings on the road there. And so party political influence in systems, and they also know that as long as sometimes it's going against the incumbents, and they know as long as they can postpone it and enter it into a prolonged legal process, then they've got more time to get on with their work or lack of work in particular councils. So it's been very devious in that way too. Sometimes parties really truly believe, and there have been cases, this goes in all directions. There have also been cases where it's really attempted disruptive behavior. And by litigation would give due space to do further and better government without possibly being unseated by scurrilous coalition that has been arising. And it has become, and also thanks often to Jacob Zuma and his approach to Stalingrad strategies, etc., it has become a big part of South African political culture nowadays to litigate and to try to get different judgments, or to rather not have serious disputes actually the results through negotiations. So it's also deliberate obstruction of the operations of those councils. Yes, and it's fascinating, the different segments of political parties internally and factions in political parties, South Africa and internationally, and how they affect coalition negotiations. I'll take your point largely as a comment, but we see that. We also see that in South African political parties, that one doesn't often know. Let's take the ANC, for example. There are parts of the ANC that are really in favor of cooperating with the EFF. Others are more tending, maybe the DA would be more constructive of this option. Others think, no, if one doesn't win an outright majority, maybe just go into the opposition benches and be a constructive opposition and hope that from there on recover and rebuild and resuscitate a political party. So it is very tricky, and I think it is going to be a contentious issue. It is a contentious issue in the ANC as well, as to whether who does the party really negotiate to this?
and that the vote shortfall may eventually be a relatively easy out from that. Yes, about infrastructure and motions of no confidence, etc. Motions of no confidence at local government level. And yes, it was not part of my presentation today, but a big part of the barometer, at least 50% of the barometer, is about governance measures and how governance was affected in those 70 case studies that we handle in this volume. And it shows the effect that it has had, very often delayed internal processes in those councils. Then we also know municipal government in South Africa is such a dismal state. I think that's not too contentious to say that one doesn't even need a local coalition in order to disrupt service delivery and processes in a particular council. But unambiguously, in many other cases, it has had a severe impact. Disruptive coalition behavior, a severe impact on delivery. And I can only hope that that is not transferred to the national level. I would like to think there will be much more responsibility, also because there will be much more visibility and enforced accountability of national government, of a possible national coalition government, much more than there could be across the large number of councils at local level. And at this point, one isn't sure here when one does advocacy and when one just does analysis. But because we're going into such an unregulated space, I think there's a huge amount of space for advocacy, for imploring a future coalition government at national and possibly some provincial levels to act more responsibly and not to follow in the footsteps of these councils that we have seen. And if the lessons from these councils can help direct us away from destructive behavior at that level, then maybe a piece of work like the barometer has already served a purpose. Thank you. Thanks, Naim.
Thank you, Susan. Keep the mic. Let me just take a few questions online. There's quite a few, and some are very deserve very short answer. First, actually 3 questions, Peggy, that you put into one. Peggy Frierken asks, it would be interesting to cross-reference the type of coalition with a simple indicator of functionality such as clean audits. Is there a type of coalition which delivers more clean audits than the other types? Also, it would be interesting to cross-reference types of coalitions with specific political parties. Is there a trend where a certain party, for example, the DA, has moved towards a typical type of coalition because they have been learning lessons from their own experience? It would be practically helpful to have this kind of information before the national government enters coalition territory.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much for that wonderful question. There are not clear-cut patterns. The stability and the constructiveness of the coalition depends across the board on how strong that coalition is of whatever type. And in some cases, some of the most stable coalitions have been when there's one strong party and one smaller party coming together. In some cases, that has been the ANC and the Patriotic Alliance in several municipalities. In quite a number of municipalities, we've seen it was the DA and the Freedom Front Plus. Or some community parties, both the ANC and the DA have done well in strong, stable coalitions with some of the community parties. Community parties have also crossed coalitions, but when there is predictability and certainty that that coalition is going to last, that there is not going to be an easy replacement, easy set of coalition helpings and crossings between different major parties, smaller parties to major parties, then those have been very stable. And yes, that stability has helped with more constructive government. Clean, there is not, in the barometer, we definitely look at clean audits and how well political parties are performing there. In the online available summary of the coalition's barometer, that high level summary we've got there, there are also a few references there to cross-tabulation of coalitions, coalition types, and clean audits. There isn't a clear-cut picture that emerges from that. Yes, there is quite a bit of variation. So yes, please refer back to that summary that is online or email me and I can point you to further slides that I've got on the correlation, cross-tabulation of those, but we cannot hope to get clear-cut pictures there. It really depends from case to case and how strongly that coalition is maintained on the ground. Thank you, Renee.
Judging from the questions online, you're going to get lots of emails. Let me just take another couple here. And just to beg your indulgence, everyone in the room and online, we were supposed to have the closing remarks in 3 minutes. We'll extend the time. The incentive for people in the room is that there's food. For those online, your questions will get answered. That's the incentive. Kolisi Vilakazi asks, what is the meaning of the Freedom Front Plus contesting to be premier in the Western Cape? What is the implication of that? The fact that they are part of the multi-party chart.
Oh, the Freedom Front Plus contesting to be premier. I'm quite cynical about that. Everybody's contesting to be premier and president in this election, honestly. But it would probably mean that they have high hopes of building a governing coalition with a Democratic Alliance and using a kind of patriotic alliance repertoire like the patriotic alliance that's on the ANC and the DA, and the Freedom Front then doing them on the DA and saying, we'll give you our support to make sure you get a majority here, provided you give us a premiership. So that is a sort of standard South African campaigning by now.
Thank you. Another party-related question. Eric asks, on the possibility of the ANC losing Gauteng, sorry. Do you envision a coalition government for the province? And B, how do you think Gauteng will influence the national vote?
Yes, first, how Gauteng influences the national vote, but obviously big way, because it is the most populous province and the highest number of registered voters. Quite a few also even ahead of KwaZulu-Natal coming from Gauteng. So Gauteng vote is going to have a huge impact. And naturally, like KwaZulu-Natal, between KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, whatever happens in these two provinces is going to have a huge carryover effect onto national government and the national result. So yes, if ANC does not get an outright majority in Gauteng, which is quite possible because it hasn't grown in the province and it already 5 years ago only came in by less than 1% by decimals. It is on the cards that it will be the case, and that will affect ANC's vote at national level.
TK Pue asks 2 questions. First, should we see coalitions as a development or crisis of political and policy leadership in South Africa? Second, do South African parties have actual ideological leanings? I make reference, he says, or she says, to the Val Alternative Alliance, Lekgotla, in your study, and where it seems that opportunism seems the driver and not ideologies.
Yes, TK, hi, thanks for your questions. Coalitions as development or crisis. Yeah, one would hope one doesn't have to choose between crisis or development, and that there can actually be some constructive results from this
if it is a crisis of no longer having one party having majorities. I would hope that if we then enter a coalition period at this point of time, several sides, that there can indeed be more consensus, more shared programs, more commitment to just getting South Africa out of the economic crisis and policy crisis that we have been experiencing, that it can really be a constructive period in South African politics, and with necessary maturity and encouragement from political parties, accepting this moment in South African politics as one of a transition, moving from one party dominance to a more inclusive national consensus action. I actually think coalition government can be a very constructive period, very good for development in general. And yes, DK has got it absolutely right with the inherent content in his question. Opportunism is much stronger than strong ideological stances. No way. No. Principle comes with distance, secondly, in these contests.
Thank you, Susan. Let me take a couple of questions from the room before I move back to the online ones. Yes.
Prof. Raymond, just want to know, the Copper department, they gazetted the Copper department. Yeah. So yesterday, they gazetted the local government municipal status amendment bill as a way to bring more stability into policies. So the bill wants to set a 1% threshold for a party to gain a seat in the council. And it also wants to make coalition agreements binding. And another point is the speaker, the mayor, the deputy mayor, they can only be removed after 2 years after they have been elected. So I don't know from you, do you think this bill will bring stability in municipals and also metros that we see a lot of instability over the past 2 years?
Hi, Deborah Byrne from the Foundation for Human Rights. So could we go near the scenario of the low voter turnout and what it actually ends up meaning in terms of, and it's a continuation on the previous person online. So when's the time we discuss a scenario around the issue of the possible framework inappropriacy? If we've got such high levels of exclusion, alienation, disillusioned members of our society, when are we going to go to the real other questions of maybe this isn't the system that's taking us where we need to be for majority inclusion and socioeconomic growth?
Thanks, Kwesi Mabasa from FES.
Thanks, MISTRA.
And MISTRA, because I'm not joking. Okay. Thanks, Prof, for the presentation. Just two questions from my side. I know you said that policy considerations don't feature prominently in the analysis that you conducted. Do you think that will change in the national elections because of the profiling of some of the highly contentious policy issues? Things around racial redress, the basic income grant and land. So do you think that policy questions will feature more prominently at the national level? And then secondly, there's this assumption, and you see it when people write about coalitions, and that coalitions automatically lead to more accountability. And I think from what you presented, that hasn't necessarily been the case. Now, if that has happened at the local government level, don't you think it's going to be more difficult to increase that level of accountability we're heading towards national elections? Because the assumption is that local government is the interface. People mostly interface with the state. So yeah, those are the two questions.
So let me just throw in a question that Njabulo, my colleague Njabulo, is collecting all the questions online. It's now doubled since the last time I saw it. But a question that that relates to the first question that was asked now. What is Prof's view on the proposition made by both the ANC and DA on increasing the electoral threshold to 1 or 2%, and that the party with majority votes should be given preference to lead coalition governments. From Boikanyo Collins.
Thank you very much. A whole bunch of lovely questions. I'll be very brief in my answers here. First, yes, Raymond, fascinating. Yes, exactly that. That bill that is now being considered. And a few of the proposals in there have got a direct bearing on what we talked about here today. This year threshold, and the last question also came with the threshold issue. And the threshold of 1% is being proposed there. 1% seems like a reasonable threshold by international. We get some systems internationally where there's even a 5% threshold. It immediately cuts the number of political parties that are represented in any council, or it would be, should that be transferred to national, it would happen there as well. And it could definitely help cut the proliferation of little parties and destructive role that they, destabilizing role that they can play. We also always have to be mindful still of the South African Constitution that requires that there will be proportionality in general. It's going to be a big issue, which I think Brooks will be litigated in the end, as to at what level does the threshold no longer allow for general proportionality? When will parties be able to say they are now excluded? Because currently we have what we call a natural threshold. If you have enough, that means 0.25% of the national vote to get one seat in a 400-seater National Assembly, then that national level brought you in there. We know, and yes, we operate in a society where there is a lot of entrenchment now of small political parties. At the National Coalitions Dialogue last year in August, there was big fallout around the issue of an increased threshold that would limit the number of parties. So I think, personally, I think small parties are help reflect so much of a diversity of culture. If there is no singular movement to one political party, one opposition party, it is where our politics are coming to terms with new realities in interim, and in due course, I'm sure there will be bigger convergence there. So I wonder to what extent it is a forced measure to force small political parties out of the equations rather than address the real issue of what does two political parties actually offer to get to the, but the threshold is a big issue. And yeah, arguments for and against. And part of the proposals in that legislation also that the coalition agreement should be binding. There is a lot to be said, and I think it's also implicit in my presentation here, that it should be taken seriously. Political parties that enter a coalition, I really think should be forming a coalition agreement, and that should be public and should be binding and should be valid for at least a certain period. So that is a big part of it, and I certainly agree with that. In the proposals, that was also in the last question that came online, is the issue of the majority party, and that links to what I referred to in my presentation as the ANC, that scenario 7, in which ANC could possibly opt for a minority government. We see there was a lot of push, there was a lot of resentment against that type of proposal at the National Coalitions Dialogue in last year, that August one, where the ANC tried to get that in as one of the principles of taking coalition politics forward. The political parties really objected against that. And we again saw the ANC trying to bring that in when we considered coalitions framework and possibilities there. And it is in this legislation. where it really takes the scenario 7 situation further, and where it wants to argue that the biggest party be given the rights are recognized as the majority party, because it is a majority in some sense of the word. So, but I really do not think that is going to fly as a kind of endorsement of a minority, senior minority status as a de facto majority. I don't think that will go down in South African politics at all. I'll just briefly refer to in general about the issue of low voter turnout, and there is so much alienation and disillusionment, lack of trust, declining trust in South African public institutions. I really think that is such a concerning thing that, and especially of younger generation too, low buy-in into South Africa's formal political system. And if a coalition government, and maybe I'm putting too much trust here in future coalition governments, but if they can see as one of their major tasks to recreate, resuscitate trust in South Africa's political institutions and system, maybe trust can also be elicited through better action against corruption, more transparency there. Let's hope coalitions bring more transparency and not less transparency, and not more co-optive strategies that will hide corruption. But it is in this rebuilding and strengthening of the system of government and the system institutions of state that I think we can have some prospects for future better participation again. The question is whether this time around it is going to be higher or lower. Arguments go in both directions. Lower because of this type of distrust and lack of belief that the political system is making a difference to people's lives, that government is making a sufficient positive impact on people's lives. And yes, the despondency that is also out there. So there's so much work that has to be done in that, and hopefully a coalition government can bring improvement. Let's hope we are not too starry-eyed about this. Kwesi, yes, you bring some lovely issues to the table, whether in case there is this coalition, can we see more racial redress, more policy compromises, or concessions, or just advancement? I think it is absolutely beyond any argument that policy change is needed, that more inclusion, both racial identity, minorities, and economically excluded South Africans. Those people will have to be included better in future policy and governance deliberations in South Africa. And if coalitions can bring that and force that type of concession in a systemic, responsible manner executed in that, and with urgency, then that would be another reason why coalitions can really work better than the system we've had until now. Thank you. There are big debates in there.
Big debates and still more questions.
Mine are not questions.
Thank you.
Just observations, but you may want to respond to this. Having read the whole marriages of inconvenience and the summary of the barometer, there's this observation that is made with regard to durability of coalitions and electoral cycles. That as you move towards the next election, then there is a tendency on the part of the partners to weigh whether they are belonging to a coalition will undermine their performance in the coming election. And so the question arises in one's mind, whether in the work itself, I don't quite recall it, we have done any quantitative analysis with regard to that cycle. Because maybe some study of that going forward may then warn South Africans on when to put on their seatbelts. Because you might as well have, let's say, a coalition post this election, but as you approach the local government election, there may be instability. That's the first issue that requires further reflection. The second one is whether we need to engage constitutional experts with regard to whether some of the proposals that are being made would pass constitutional muster. If you were to introduce a threshold, either for the legislature or for the executive, and you were taken to the Constitutional Court, would that actually succeed in terms of the balance of rights and responsibilities and the kind of constraints that you can introduce with regard to political rights that people have? The last one, again, for reflection, as they say in flights, in the unlikely event of a national coalition after this election, one of the questions that may arise that requires reflection is the notion of a social compact in relation to socio-economic issues. And related to that would then be the question in the inverse. How would a social compact manifest itself in party politics? In network, for instance, besides government, you have labor, you have business, you have civil society. Who are the political representatives of those constituencies? And can a social compact or attempts at a social compact find expression at political level? It's just an issue for reflection. Thanks.
Thank you. And for those who might not know, that's Joel Nechitenze, the Executive Director of MISTRA. He remained hidden until then. Susan, I'm going to throw in one or two questions from the online questions. Mtulisi Vilakazi, two questions. Do personalities play a role in South African politics, or has society moved beyond personalities to policy postulations? And second one, what should be the role of public participation and involvement in coalition formation? Question. And then two questions also from Eric Stillerman. First, what are the most effective mechanisms to stabilize coalitions for service delivery? And kind of related, what are the most effective mechanisms of ensuring coalition stability? The most effective mechanisms for ensuring coalition stability and ensuring service delivery.
That's it. Is that it, the question?
No, there's more.
Oh.
Yes, you allowing us to stay a little longer. Will pick us out.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with the last questions. Personality role vis-a-vis policy. One sees so much scope for both here. I think we are actually in a period where there is just no, at national party political level, there are a few names that immediately pop out as, yes, they dominate over their political parties. And they, the EFF and the MK party immediately come to mind. But beyond that, there isn't such clear, including an ANC, not such clear-cut person that stands out, or an DA, as the inspirational leader that can drive this party, can mobilize, can build support for that party. So yes, yes. And simultaneously, policy is not that strong in current party political deliberations. There are always questions as to how policy stands that should be strong are being moderated. To what extent in this coalition dynamic that we have at the moment, there are compromises on that, that we move away from strong policy stances to help make ourselves look more attractive to possible investors and make sure maybe we get a ministership or a deputy presidency or what the case may be. So it's such a mixture of both these issues, and there isn't a clear choice, there's a clear choice, isn't a clear answer as to policy or personality. We are in an era now where they really are both very, very moderated. And then mechanisms for stability, let me jump to that one. Service delivery. Again, it depends so much. There isn't a clear-cut trend that this type of coalition and these type of measures in a coalition necessarily going to give more stability in coalition government. It's all about whether the parties cooperate together, those essentials of coalition politics, whether those parties cooperate and maintain their majority and not become vulnerable to be captured by a competing coalition. That is, if any mechanism can be identified there, it's really about the parties cooperating and holding that, protecting that relationship from being hijacked by opposition formations that are going to use any sign of weakness in that to gain power. And that gaining of power, continuous contest for political power, that is the antithesis of stability in local government coalitions and at national level as well, if we get to that point. Because when there is a vulnerability and opposition parties see the opportunity, they're going for that. The victories that they did not get in election times, they will try to pursue those and get those through coalitions. And that is a point where political parties have such a huge responsibility as to encouraging and fostering the responsible behavior of their affiliates across the different councils, across the different provinces, that there aren't deliberate efforts to use those coalition situations to try to gain the power that they did not get through elections. That is the main point of maturity in party politics, and that will go a long way. And I know from conversations that even at national government level, the ANC doesn't always trust its affiliates and its representatives at different political sides to have that maturity. That they, even when they consider frameworks for coalition government, say that, but we prefer legislation over when we, like Professor Jaap de Visser and I would say, but political bodies have to be encouraged. So the cooperative coalition cultures have to be fostered by political parties. The argument is, but will rather work through legislation. We rather should get legislation to regulate that. And without that natural process among political parties to pull things together and not to use coalitions destructively, we're really going to have big problems on that front. On the electoral cycle, in a coalitions barometer, we do not do quantitative analysis. There are many qualitative case studies. We do not count as to
the specific situations of political parties feeling negatively affected in the run-up to elections. And because our national and provincial on the one hand run on different electoral cycles to the local government coalitions, we have pretty irregular, as you also alluded to, coalitions, and there can be a continuous stream of exit from coalitions because there will always be an election that is looming. So there is a lot of instability just because of that. And there will be more in future once political parties start realizing, especially at higher national and provincial level. Of course, we've had provincial coalitions before, but the political environment is quite different at this stage. And as political parties start seeing how it potentially affects at their party at national level, what happens at the local level, there could also be more stability at the local level. Yes, but that is certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. And constitutional experts, I believe, should really be engaged preemptively to get a good sense. Constitutional academics, lawyers so far have offered a few opinions on that, but they vary. They really vary on that. So what will be the constitutional experts' interpretation of generally proportional, and what level of threshold will that cutoff point be? Will it have to be a natural threshold of 0.25%, or could it be pushed out by 1 or 2%? Yes, and national coalitions and social compacts, there is a lot of scope. I'm not going to try to analyze that in detail, but there's a lot of scope for civil society, for a range of organizations to help foster a better social consensus on policies, on necessary policy change, and not to see policy change in this current conjuncture as something necessarily negative. Policy change, if coalitions forge more policy change, it could very well be a very good thing. And I think many of the institutions and civil society can play a big role, not just in helping to advance a sense of this is a time for political parties to come together and forge new policies, but it's also, given that this is such an unregulated terrain that we're entering nationally and provincially now, in all likelihood, that civil society will have to be extremely vigilant. And I believe we'll really have to insist, and media and range of organizations insist in being informed of what coalition negotiations are being conducted. What is the content of it? What is the nature of the agreement? Are there policy agreements at stake? There should probably be if there aren't, but we are in a period where I believe there's a massive amount of scope for much more enforced public accountability. Because just from political parties and the election result, that won't be enough to bring it automatically. Thank you.
Thank you. We half an hour over time, so I'm not going to take the other questions that we have online, Tambani, Carol, and others. Very sorry about that, and people in the room that might have questions. So we move towards closure. I'm going to ask Sebastian Sperling, the Executive Director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to come and make some closing remarks. And thank you, FES, again.
Thank you so much, Naeem. Good morning still. Good day. It didn't need another proof, but this is proof again how important the work of MISTRA is and how useful it is to many of us, to all of us here, certainly. I think I say this not only on behalf of FES, not only on behalf of Pindile Kunene, who should have been here, can't be here, but is leading this area of work at FES. But I guess I say this on behalf of many who have witnessed now this presentation. It's important because it's relevant and thorough at the same time, the work that you do. All of us are now in this particular moment in time interested in coalitions, of course, but you are presenting us with very thorough work that has started many, many years ago, that you intensified then in recent years in monitoring local government coalition agreements and coalitions. So this thank you goes out to the leadership of MISTRA, Joel, Abba, but in this case particularly, of course, to the research lead, Susan. That is impressive work and immensely useful. I had the privilege of reading already the full version, not all, but like most. And I can only encourage you to do the same, to download it from the MISTRA website and have a look at it. And there's three main takeaways that I think are immensely important going forward. For me personally, it's a very personal selection of takeaways, and there are many more in the book for sure. But the first one is really that coalitions can work in South Africa. And that is, like we might assume the opposite with our lived experience, particularly as citizens of Gauteng. And because the failures get more attention, as you said, but half of the coalitions that were established in 2021 are still operational. Many of them are governing successfully, as also some of the case studies show. So they can work, they do work already in South Africa. That's the first takeaway. And the second, yes, there is, like, for us to increase the chances for them to be successful and stable, there's a lot to be said about regulation. And we talked about this, you presented it, a lot of the questions went into this direction. But when you look into all of those cases and a lot of the questions that came, it's not only about regulation, it's also about political maturity and culture that needs to develop. And this was a point that came out in the national dialogue last year, that also came out in the dialogue that UNDP, SALGA organized in February, where you also enriched the debate with the results. When we speak about political culture, it's a lot about the nature of these agreements. The substance, ideally program over positions and power only, but like programmatic agreements. And then related to that also a different level of transparency when it comes to these agreements, so that there's also a different accountability towards those agreements. And I think this is a topic and an ambition that all of us Democrats should share, that political culture develops in that sense. And this leads me to my third and last takeaway from this. I mean, you know that FES, as an international organization, we love organizing international experience sharing. It's very much our DNA. But in this particular case, we think it's a lot more valuable to look into the experience that grows in South Africa in a given political, cultural, societal context. This political culture that we need for coalitions can't be prescribed, it can't be copied, but it's something that is a result of actions, of the development. It needs to grow. And this is why it's so fundamentally important to look into what's already happening in South Africa and what is going to happen. So this is why we can only encourage you, MISTRA, continue that work, to look into what's happening, to be so systematic about analyzing it. And I guess it goes to all of us to continue that dialogue about it. And obviously, building that culture is not only a responsibility of political parties, but it's a responsibility of all of us citizens and civil society at large. So thank you so much. We will surely be back to that topic soon. Thanks, MISTRA. Thanks to the team of MISTRA and FES that made this presentation possible. Thanks to all of you here and online. And I can only encourage you to download the full version. Congratulations, MISTRA, for the launch. I think there's some bites and drinks next door, so I'll invite you to come over.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your big part.
No, I suppose I'm not.
Yeah, we.
I want down.
Conversations, yeah.
It's gonna